Good morning, guys. I'm back in the recliner. Don't mind my hair. It's looking a little bit crazy, but I'm going to read you chapters 13 through 16 of Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech. I'm so loving it. I hope you guys are actually listening to me. If not, that's totally fine. I need to reread the book anyways. But the previous video had me reading 10, 11, and 12, so we're on to chapter 13 now. And chapter 13 is called Bouncing Brickway. Chapter 13 of my book is on page 80. So, let's get in. It was time to tell Graham and Gramps about Mr. Birkway. Mr. Birkway was mighty strange. I didn't know what to make of him. I thought he might have been a few squirrels in the attic of his brain. He was one of those energetic teachers who loved his subject half to death and leapt around the room dramatically, waving his arms and clenching his chest and whomping people on the back. He said brilliant and wonderful and terrific. He was tall and slim and had bushy black hair. He was tall and slim, and his bushy black hair made him look wild, but he had enormous, deep brown, cow-like eyes that sparkled all over the place. And when he turned those eyes on you, you felt as if his whole purpose in life was to stand there and listen to you, and you alone. Midway through the first class, Mr. Birkway asked for everyone's summer journals. He flung himself up and down the aisles receiving the journals, as if they were manna from heaven. Wonderful, he said to each journal giver. I was worried. I had no journal. She doesn't have a journal because she's new to the school, right? She just moved. On top of Mary Lou's Finney's desk were 6 journals. 6. Mr. Birkway said, Heaven's mercy, can it be Shakespeare? He counted the journals. 6. Brilliant, magnificent. Christy and Megan, 2 girls who had their own club called GGP, whatever that meant, were whispering over on the other side of the room, casting malevolent looks in Mary Lou's direction. Mary Lou kept her hand on top of her journals as Mr. Birkway reached for them. In a low voice, she said, I don't want you to read them. What? Mr. Birkway boomed. Not read them? The whole room was silent. Mr. Birkway scooped up Mary Lou's journals before she could even blink and said, Don't be silly. Brilliant. Thank you. Another girl, Beth Ann, looked as if she might cry. Phoebe was sending me messages with her eyebrows that indicated that she was not too pleased either. I think they were all hoping that Mr. Birkway was not actually going to read those journals. Mr. Birkway went around the whole room snatching journals. Alex Chesney's journal was covered with basketball stickers. Christy and Megan's was slathered over with pictures of male models. The cover of Ben's was a cartoon of a boy with a normal boy's head, but the arms and legs were pencils, and out of the tips of his hands and feet were dribbles of words. When he got to Phoebe's desk, Mr. Birkway lifted up her plain journal and peeked inside. Phoebe was trying to slide down in her chair. I didn't write much, Phoebe said. In fact, I can hardly remember what I wrote about at all. By that time, Mr. Birkway got to me. My heart was clobbering around so hard I thought it might leap straight out of my chest. Deprived child, he said. You didn't have a chance to write a journal. I'm new. New? How blessed, he said. There's nothing in the whole wide world that is better than a new person. So I didn't know about the journals. Not to worry, Mr. Birkway said. I'll think of something. I wasn't sure what that meant. I thought maybe he would give me a whole lot of extra homework or something. For the rest of the day, you could see little groups of people asking each other, Did you write about me? I was very glad I hadn't written anything. For a while, we didn't hear any more about the journals. We had absolutely no idea all the trouble they were going to cause. That is the end of chapter 13. Ugh, I wonder what these kids wrote in their journals. Chapter 14 is where we're going to start next. The rhododendron. I think I'm saying that right. I could be saying it wrong, but chapter 14 nevertheless. One Saturday, I was at Phoebe's again. Her father was golfing and her mother was running errands. Mrs. Winterbottom had read out a long list to us of where she would be in case we needed her. If we hear any noises at all, we're supposed to call the police immediately. After you called the police, Mrs. Winterbottom said, call Mrs. Cadaver. I think she's home today. I'm sure she would come right over. Oh, sure, Phoebe whispered to me. That's about the last person I would call. Phoebe's imagined that every noise was a lunatic sneaking in or the message leaver creeping up to drop another anonymous note. She was so jumpy that I began to feel uneasy too. After her mother left, Phoebe said, Mrs. Cadaver works odd hours, doesn't she? Sometimes she works every night for a week, straggling home when most people are waking up, but sometimes she works during the day. She's a nurse, so I guess she works different shifts, I said. That day, Mrs. Cadaver was home, puttering around her garden. We saw her from Phoebe's bedroom window. Actually, puttering is not the best word. She was doing a lot more than like sludging and slashing. Mrs. Cadaver hacked branches off the trees and hurled these to the back of her lot when she lumped them into a pile of branches that she had hacked off last week. I told you, she's as strong as an ox, Phoebe said. Strong as an ox. There's the simile. As comparison using like or as. Next, Mrs. Cadaver slashed and sliced at a pitiful rose bush that had been trying to creep up the side of her house. Then she sheared off the top of the hedge that borders Phoebe's yard. She moved on to the rhododendron bush, which she was poking and prodding when a car pulled into her driveway. A tall man with bushy black hair leaped out, and seeing her, he practically skipped back to where she was. They hugged each other. Oh no, Phoebe said. The tall man with bushy black hair was Mr. Berkway, our English teacher. Mrs. Cadaver pointed to the rhododendron bush and then at the axe, but Mr. Berkway shook his head. He disappeared into the garage and returned with 2 shovels. Then he and Mrs. Cadaver gouged and prodded and tunneled around in the dirt until the poor old rhododendron flopped onto its side. They lugged the bush to the opposite side of the yard where there was a mound of dirt, and they replanted the bush. Maybe there's something hidden under the bush, Phoebe said. Like what? Like Mr. Cadaver? As I told you before, maybe Mr. Berkway helped her chop up her husband and bury him. And maybe they're getting worried and decided to disguise the spot with a rhododendron bush. I might have looked skeptical, Phoebe said. Sal, you never can tell. And Sal, I don't think you and your father should go over there anymore. I certainly agreed with her on that one. Dad and I had been over there 2 nights earlier, and I had hardly been able to sit still. I started noticing all these frightening things in Margaret's house. Creepy masks, old swords, books with titles like The Murderers of the Rule Morgue and The Skull and the Hatchet. Margaret cornered me in the kitchen and said, So what has your father told me about me? Nothing, I said. Oh, she seemed disappointed. My father's behavior was always different at Margaret's. At home, I would sometimes find him sitting on his bed staring at the floor, or reading through old letters, or gazing at the album. He looked sad and lonely, but at Margaret's he would smile and sometimes even laugh. And once she touched his hand, and he let her hand rest there on top of his. I didn't like it. I didn't want my father to be sad, but at least when he was sad, I knew he was remembering my mother. So when Phoebe suggested that my father and I should not go to Margaret's, I was quite willing to agree with that notion. When Phoebe's mother came home from running errands, she looked terrible. She was sniffling and blowing her nose. Phoebe said that we were going to do our homework upstairs. I said, maybe we should have helped her put the groceries away. She likes to do that by herself, Phoebe said. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Phoebe said. I've lived with her my whole life, haven't I? She looks as if she's been crying. Maybe something's wrong. Maybe something is bothering her. Don't you think she would say so then? Maybe she's afraid to, I said. I wondered why it was so easy for me to see that Phoebe's mother was worried and miserable, but Phoebe couldn't see it. Or if she could, that she was ignoring it. Maybe she didn't want to notice. Maybe it was too frightening of a thing. I wondered if this is how it had been with my mother. Were there things I didn't notice? Later that afternoon, when Phoebe and I went downstairs, Mrs. Winterbottom was talking with Prudence. Do you think I lead a tiny life? She asked. How do you mean? Prudence said as she filed her nails. Do we have any nail polish remover? Phoebe's mother retrieved a bottle of nail polish remover from the bathroom. Oh, Prudence said, before I forget, do you think you could sew up the hem on my brown skirt so I could wear it tomorrow? Oh, please. Prudence tilted her head to the side, tugged at her hair in exactly the same way Phoebe does, and smooshed up her mouth in a little pout. Doesn't Prudence know how to sew? I asked. Of course she does, Phoebe said. Why? I was just wondering why she doesn't sew her own skirt. Sal, you're becoming very critical. Before I left Phoebe's that day, Mrs. Winterbottom handed Prudence her brown skirt with the newly sewn hem, and all the way home I wondered about Mrs. Winterbottom and what she'd meant about living a tiny life. If she didn't like all that baking and cleaning and jumping up to get bottles of nail polish remover and sewing hems, why did she do it? Why didn't she tell them to do some of these things themselves? Maybe she was afraid there'd be nothing left for her to do. There would be no need for her, and she would become invisible, and no one would notice. When I got home that day, my father handed me a package. It's from Margaret, he said. What is it? I don't know. Why don't you open it? Inside was a blue sweater. I put it back in the box and went upstairs. My father followed me. Sal, do you like it? I don't want it, I said. She was just trying to. She likes you. I don't care if she likes me or not, I said. My father stood there looking around the room. I want to tell you something about Margaret, he said. Well, I don't want to hear it. I was feeling so completely ornery. When my father left the room, I could still hear my own voice saying, I don't want to hear it. I sounded exactly like Phoebe. Snap. So, once again, we don't know what's up with Mrs. Cadaver, but she knows Mr. Berkway. And Sal's saying Phoebe's really being, not understanding her mom, but then Sal's kind of doing the same thing with her dad. On to chapter 15. A snake has a snack. Dun 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 dun. Fun fact, my husband's super afraid of snakes. I'm not very fond of them either, but he hates them. It was hotter than blazes in South Dakota. In Sioux Falls, Gramps took off his shirt. Passing Mitchell, Gramps unbuttoned her dress down to the waist. Just beyond Chamberlain, Gramps took a detour to the Missouri River. He parked the car beneath the tree overlooking a shady bank. Graham and Gramps kicked off their shoes. It was quiet and hot, hot, hot. All you could hear was a crow calling somewhere up the river and the distant sounds of cars along the highway. The hot air pressed against my face, and my hair was like a hot, heavy blanket draped around my neck and back. It was so hot you could smell the heat baking the stones and dirt along the bank. Gram pulled her dress up over her head, and Gramps undid his buckle and let his pants slide to the ground. They started kicking water at each other and scooping it up and letting it run down their face. They walked into where it was knee deep and sat down. Come on, Chick Bitty, Gramps called. Gramps said, It's delicious. I gazed up and down the river. Not a soul in sight. The water looked cool and clean. Gram and Gramps sat in the river grinning away. I waded in and sat down. It was nearly heaven with the cool water rippling and a high, clear sky all around us, the trees waving along the banks. My hair floated all around me. My mother's hair had been long and black like mine, but a week before she left, she cut it. My father said to me, Don't cut yours, Sal. Please don't cut yours. My mother said, I knew you wouldn't like it if I cut mine. My father said, I didn't say anything about yours. But I know what you're thinking, he said. I loved your hair, Sugar, he said. I saved her hair. I swept it up from the kitchen floor and wrapped it in a plastic bag and hid it beneath the floorboards of my room. It was still there, along with the postcards she sent. As Graham and Gramps and I sat in the Missouri River, I tried not to think of the postcards. I tried to concentrate on the high sky and the cool water. Would have been a perfect except for an ornery crow calling, "Car, car, car." "Will we be here long?" I asked. A boy came out of nowhere. Graham saw him first and whispered, "Get behind me, Chickabiddy. You too," he said to Graham. The boy was about 15 or 16 with shaggy dark hair. He wore blue jeans and no shirt. His chest was brown and muscular. In his hand he held a bowie knife, its sheath fastened to his belt. He stood next to Graham's pants on the bank. I thought of Phoebe, and knew if she were here, she would be warning us all that this boy was a lunatic who would hack us all to pieces. I was wishing we had never stopped at the river, that my grandparents would be more cautious, maybe even a little more like Phoebe, who saw danger everywhere. As the boy stared at us, Gramps said, "Howdy." The boy said, "This here's private property." Gramps looked all around us. "Is it?" I didn't see any signs. "It's private property." "Why, heck," Gramps said, "this here's a river. I never heard of no river being private property." The boy picked up Grandpa's pants and slid his hand into the pocket. "This land where I'm standing is private property." I was frightened of the boy, and I wanted Gramps to do something, but Gramps looked cool and calm. He sounded as if he hadn't a care in the world, but I knew that he was worried by the way he kept inching in front of me and Graham. I felt around the riverbed, pulled up a flat stone, and skimmed it across the water. The boy watched the stone, counting the skips. A snake flinched along the bank and slid into the water. "See that tree?" Gramps said. He pointed to an old willow leaning into the water near where the boy stood. "I see it," the boy said, sliding his hands in another of Gramps' pocket. Gramps said, "See that keyhole? Watch what this here chickabiddy can do to a knothole." Gramps winked at me. The veins in his neck were standing out. You could practically see the blood rushing through them. I felt around the riverbed and pulled up another flat, jagged rock. I had done this a million times in the swimming hole in Bybanks. I pulled my arm back and tossed the rock straight at the tree. One edge embedded itself in the knothole. The boy stopped rummaging through Grandpa's pocket and eyed me. Graham said, "Oh!" and flailed in the water. She reached down, pulled up a snake, and gave Gramps a puzzled look. "It's a water moccasin, isn't it?" she said. "It's a poisonous one, isn't it?" The snake slithered and wiggled, straining towards the water. "I do believe it has had a snack out of my leg." She stared hard at Gramps. The boy stood on the bank holding Gramps' wallet. Gramps scooped up Graham and carried her out of the water. "Would you mind dropping that thing?" he said to Graham, who was still clutching the snake. To me, he said, "Get out of there, Chickabiddy." As Gramps put Graham on the riverbank, the boy came and knelt beside her. "I'm sure glad you have that knife," Gramps said, reaching for it. As he made a slit in Graham's leg across the snake bite, blood trickled down her ankle. I grabbed Gramps' hand as she stared up at the sky. Gramps knelt to suck out the wound, but the boy said, "Here, I'll do it." He placed his mouth against Gramps' bloody leg, and he sucked and spit, sucked and spit. Graham's eyelids fluttered. "Can you point us to the hospital?" Gramps said. The boy nodded as he spit. Gramps and the boy carried Graham to the car and settled her in the back while I snatched their clothes from the riverbank. We placed Graham's head on my lap and her feet on the boy's lap, and all the while the boy continued sucking and spitting. In between, he gave directions to the hospital. Graham held onto my hand. Graham, still in his boxer shorts, dripping wet, carried Graham into the hospital. The boy's mouth hovered over her leg the whole time, sucking and spitting. Graham spent the night at the hospital. In the waiting room, the boy from the riverbank sprawled in the chair. I offered him a paper towel. "You've got blood on your mouth," I said. I handed him a $50 bill. "My grandfather said to give you this. That's all the cash he has right now. He said to tell you thanks. He'd come out himself, but he doesn't want to leave her." He looked at the $50 bill in my hand. "I don't need it." "You don't have to stay," I said. He glanced around the waiting room. "I know it." He looked away, then said, "I like your hair." I was thinking of cutting it. Don't. I sat down beside him. He said it wasn't really private property. I didn't think so. Later, I went in to see Graham, and she was all tucked in bed, pale and sleepy. Next to her on the narrow bed, Gramps was lying on top of the covers, stroking her hair. The nurse came in and made him get off the bed. He had, by now, put his pants on, but he looked a wreck. I asked Graham how she was feeling. She blinked her eyes a few times and said, "Piddles." Gramps said they must have given her something. She doesn't know what she's saying. I leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Graham, don't leave us." Piddles. When the nurse left the room, Gramps climbed back on top of the bed and lay down next to Graham. He patted the bed. "Well," he said, "this ain't our marriage bed, but it'll do." So poor Grams, she was bit by a water moccasin, and those are poisonous. And that boy was trying to like suck out the poison from her leg. FYI, don't ever try that. I don't actually know if it works, but that's definitely slowing down their trip. They're stuck in a hospital overnight. They're definitely not traveling if they're stuck in a hospital. Hopefully, Grams is okay. Luckily, that boy was there to point him into like space to a hospital. But one more chapter today, the singing tree, chapter 16. Graham was released from the hospital the next morning, mainly because she was so ornery. Gramps wanted her to stay another day, but Graham climbed out of bed and said, "Where's my underwear?" "I guess that cantankerous woman is getting out of here," Gramps said. I think fear had all made us a little cantankerous. I had spent the night in the waiting room. Gramps offered to get me a motel room, but I was afraid that if I left the hospital, I would never see Graham again. The boy we had met at the river curled up in the armchair, but I didn't think he slept either. Once he used the telephone. I heard him say, "Yeah, I'll be home in the morning. I'm with some friends." The boy woke me up at 6 o'clock and said Graham was much better. He handed me a piece of paper. "It's my address, in case you ever want to write or anything. But I understand if you didn't." I opened up the paper. "What's your name?" He said, "Oh, yeah, right." He took the paper and added his name. "Tom Fleet." "See ya," he said. As we were checking out of the hospital, I asked if we should call my father. Gramps said, "Well, now, Chickabiddy, I thought about that, but I was only going to make him worry. Don't you think we could call him when we get to Idaho?" Gramps was right, but I was disappointed. I was ready to call my father. I wanted very much to hear his voice, but I was also afraid that I might ask him to come and get me. Outside the hospital, I heard the wobbling of a bird. Warber. Warble? Maybe it's warble. Outside the hospital, I heard the warble of a bird, and it was such a familiar warble that I stopped and listened for its source. Bordering the parking lot was a rim of poplars. The sound was coming from somewhere in the top of those trees, and I thought instantly of the singing tree in Bybanks. Next to my favorite sugar maple tree besides the barn was a tall aspen. When I was younger, I heard the most beautiful bird song coming from the top of that tree. It was not a call, it was a true bird song. With trails and warbles, I stood beneath the tree for the longest time, hoping to catch sight of the bird who was singing such a song. I saw no bird, only leaves waving in the breeze. The longer I stared up at the leaves, the more it seemed it was the tree itself that was singing. Every time I passed the tree, I listened. Sometimes it sang, sometimes it did not, but from then on, I always called it the singing tree. The morning after my father learned that my mother was not coming back, he left for Lewiston, Idaho. Graham and Gramps came to stay with me. I had pleaded to go along, but my father said he didn't think I should have to go through that. That day I climbed up into the maple and watched the singing tree, waiting for it to sing. I stayed there all day, and on into the evening. It did not sing. At dusk, Gramps placed 3 sleeping bags at the foot of the tree, and he and Graham and I slept there all night. The tree did not sing. In the hospital parking lot, Gramps heard the song too. "Oh, Salamonica," she said, "a singing tree." She pulled at Gramps' sleeves. "Oh, it's a good sign, don't you think?" As we swept across South Dakota towards the Badlands, the whispers no longer said, "Hurry, hurry," or "Rush, rush." They now said, "Slow down, slow down." Could not figure this out. It seemed sort of warning, but I did not have much time to think about it as I was busy telling about Phoebe. Alright, so Grams was released from the hospital. She seems a little bit better. We officially learned about the singing tree. I am going to stop there for now. I will pick up again later. Happy reading, boys and girls.